Is Rob Moodie, and I have the privilege of chairing the Centre for Alcohol Policy Research Advisory Committee, and I happen to be lucky enough to host this afternoon. We've got a wonderful audience heading towards a century, so we're delighted to have you on board. I wanted to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the many lands on which I know we are all on. I'm on Wurundjeri land, Wurundjeri being, Wurrung being the Wurrung word for the manna gum, and Jerry being the word for the grub that was around the bottom of the gum. So the Wurundjeri along the Burrung Ma, which is the Yarra River, are the owners, the custodians of this land, and they've never ceded authority, never ceded that land, and it still, in a sense, is their land. I want to acknowledge their leaders, past, present, and emerging, and to acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders that happen to be on the call today. So we're going to run it today for about an hour. We want to have a facilitated discussion for about 40 minutes. Then we'd really love to hear from you. And any time that you want to put down a question, please put down the questions in the Q&A. But also, if you've got a comment, and particularly comment if you want to have a discussion with others, please use the chat function, and you can really develop and talk to each other in that regard as well. So this is an opportunity for an in-depth discussion about the themes raised in Shaun Micallef's On the Source program that sort of explores Australia's, I love this term, relationship with alcohol. As I said before, we've got now about 100 people online. We're delighted to have you there. We have 4 panelists today, and in the era of celebrity epidemiologists, we now have celebrity policy researchers. And to introduce you to them, Professor Emmanuel Kuntsche from the Centre for Alcohol Policy, who, those of you who saw it last night, he advised on the risks of alcohol while Shaun lay on the therapist's couch, like it wasn't the other way around. Emmanuel's the director of the Centre for Alcohol Policy Research. He's trained in psychology, sociology, public health, and statistics. After 18 years of with Addiction Switzerland, Emmanuel made the huge leap, and we're very fortunate about that, to Australia to join CAPR in 2017. He's published more than 300 scientific articles, book chapters, and research reports, so we're hoping that he'll lift his game a little bit more in the next couple of years. Megan Cook, who's undertaking a PhD with the Centre for Alcohol Policy Research. As you know, she was featured last night talking about her research on what young children know about adults drinking. And her research is really looking at young children's knowledge, as you will have seen last night, of alcohol, using really quite innovative and highly age-appropriate methods. Our next panelist, Caterina Giorgi, who's now the CEO of the Foundation for Alcohol Research and Evidence, a wonderful advocate. She's been doing a fantastic job in this role. It's, as you know, many of you, an independent not-for-profit organisation, really trying to work on preventing harm from alcohol. She's got a lot of experience across the not-for-profit sectors, and has been really active since she's taken on the CEO role. And finally, Michael Livingston, whom I've had the privilege of knowing for a number of years. He's worked on alcohol research for 15 years, really looking at really in-depth research on alcohol policies, on consumption and harm, and new methodological work on alcohol surveys. So we're delighted to have you guys on board. And I'm going to kick off first with a question really relating to the fact that Shaun Micallef, who I'm a big fan of, a comedian, he's done a show about a really serious health issue, and he's done it for what he hopes is a really wide audience, and obviously we hope that as well. So I guess for all of you, did anything surprise you about the show? And maybe to Emmanuel and then Caterina, what does it mean to have a comedian who's produced a show about alcohol? Why now?
Yeah, thanks so much, Rob, for that introduction. When Shaun first approached me about the possible role of the Center for Alcohol Policy Research in a documentary about alcohol, I was really surprised and suspicious a little bit, because alcohol, it's not a funny issue. It produces a lot of harm, as we know. And why a comedian would play a role in that, it's not to make fun of it. But he really convinced me about, to reach a larger audience, it has to be entertaining. No one is listening when it's not entertaining. And I think he did a fantastic job in actually showing both sides, the pros and the cons, and the enjoyment it brings for some, and the harm it brings for others. What struck me most about the show is really the ordinary commodity of alcohol, the omnipresence, and a lot of people actually talking about, like, any other beverage, any other consumption good. And the other thing I really found interesting is that it was not black and white. It was not accusing, or it was not moralizing and so on. It was just showing different sides of it, and then we could make our own mind about what we think is appropriate and not. So I think that's my first take-home message.
Lovely. Caterina?
I think one of the surprising things for me was how wonderful an actor Emmanuel is in his role on the couch. It was one of my favorite parts, and Emmanuel can do so many different things. So we need to add that to the bio now, Rob, I think.
Good.
As Emmanuel alluded to, if we're going to be changing the situation around alcohol in Australia and reducing the harms, then we need more people talking about it. And we need people other than us having that conversation. And I am always surprised at the number of people who come to me and share their stories around how alcohol has impacted their lives. And I think highlighting those stories and having those voices share the many different ways that people use alcohol and the very many different impacts that it has helps us to collectively come together and say, well, yeah, we think that this might be a problem, and we need to be doing more about it. So this show absolutely helps with that. And it definitely helps to have Shaun Micallef, who's also one of my favourites.
Great. Megan, how did you go? What did you think it was surprising?
Well, even though I was a part of the show, I didn't realise how deeply personal it was for Shaun. And that bit at the end of the first episode when he talked about his sister-in-law and how emotional it got, I was quite surprised by that. But I also really liked it. I liked that it gave an emotional depth to the show. It was kind of an emotional motivation behind the show's production, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, great. Michael?
I just want to have Emmanuel do the couch routine for our next supervision meeting. It's very impressive. But I was really surprised and impressed with the kind of amount of ground the show covered in just 3 one-hour episodes. It's, as I said in my little intro, I've been doing this for almost 15 years, and it really covered off everything, even down to kind of survey underreporting, when it had the woman who says, I'd probably drink 6 drinks, but I didn't tell my doctor I drink 3. It was just like a classic. There's a whole topic I've spent a year trying to understand in one little soundbite. It was very impressively done.
Right, which is interesting by virtue of the ground it can cover in quite a short time, I guess, yeah. I mean, we're in the COVID era. I don't know when we're going to get to post-COVID. Caterina, you've been talking about this quite a bit in terms of trends in home drinking changing in the pandemic. So what's going on?
So I think what we need to first understand, and what a lot of people might not understand, is that we do most of our drinking at home. So for people who do drink alcohol, 80% of the alcohol that we purchase is from bottle shops or takeaway. And most people say that they do most of their drinking at home. And so when you create a situation, and we're seeing this at the moment in Victoria, where you're closing all unlicensed premises or pubs, clubs and bars, then that goes up even higher. And so what we saw when we first closed pubs, clubs and bars is that there was an increase in drinking by a proportion of people. So there were a group of people who said we're drinking more alcohol, and a group of people who said that they're drinking less alcohol. And we were looking at this when we thought that there would be this period of isolation, and then we'd come back and there'd be some sort of new normal. But what we're realizing now is that this COVID situation is going to go on for some time. So we're keeping an eye on 3 different things, which is consumption data. And again, we're seeing that separation between those people who are drinking more and those people who are drinking less. Harm data, which is really important. And we're not going to really see the impacts of this until over time. So we're seeing people saying that they're drinking more daily. And those sorts of things can lead to alcohol dependence well down the track. And we're seeing some early indication from women's services that there's an increased involvement of alcohol in family violence.
Yep.
And so we're really worried about the fact that if problem drinking was a problem before, and if heavy drinking was a problem before, then what sort of problems are we seeing now? And many of those we won't hear about because they're being happening behind closed doors.
And are you seeing different promotional approaches to this as well?
It's a really good point. So alcohol advertisers have really taken the opportunity to take advantage of this situation. And so one analysis that we did with Cancer Council WA saw prolific alcohol advertising, and a significant proportion of that advertising referred to COVID and referred to drinking in isolation to get through. And we've even seen micro-targeting of segments like mums who are homeschooling and saying the way that you get through homeschooling is to have a drink at the end of the day. And those sorts of things are really unhelpful, and they're predatory at a time when people are quite vulnerable. And those sorts of things just shouldn't be allowed. So it's pointing to the fact that a regulatory system that doesn't exist, that wasn't working before, is definitely not working right now in a time of crisis.
Oh, so you mentioned homeschooling, and we're coming towards talking about young people and drinking. And Megan, it was great to have you on, see you last night. And we know your mum loved it as well. Perhaps you can tell us what you've learned about young people's drinking, or their attitude to adults drinking. And is there anything parents and caregivers should be conscious about what their children are actually being exposed to in terms of drinking?
It was lovely for my parents, I think, to see me on the TV. They very, very much enjoyed it. But in terms of the evidence, we do actually know a bit from the international evidence about what young kids know about alcohol. And even from younger ages than we explored in the show, kids are learning about alcohol. So some of the things they know, they have primarily negative views at these young ages. So if you ask them whether they think they'd consume alcohol in the future, they'd probably say no. They don't really think that consuming alcohol is a good thing. They do have some product recognition from television. So often what comes up is Homer from The Simpsons. He drinks beer. As what's explored in the show, they notice gendered preferences. So dads drink beer, mums drink wine. They also know a bit about the common situations or the appropriate situations to consume alcohol. So it's more common to drink at a party than when you're in the office, say. Yep. And some studies have also shown that they have a bit of a grasp of the legal framework. So that drink driving message is very common. But I think for parents, the thing to remember is that the way children learn about alcohol is no different from the way that they learn about anything else. It's all through observation and modelling, and that is primarily going to occur in the home.
Right. Thanks, Megan. And on the same vein, looking at a slightly, obviously, broader context, Emmanuel, we're now starting to see a decline in youth drinking. What do you think's behind that? You're on mute.
That's the classic thing, right? It's a good question. There appears to be, and I was really grateful that Shaun showed some of that in the 3rd episode. There seems to be a generation that is not as the previous one. So I was talking about that ordinary commodity, and alcohol is omnipresent and often taken for granted or actually some minds actually crucial requirement for certain social interactions. And there seems to be a generation that is not like that, to have new values like veganism, being more mindful, being more conscious of the action. And but of course the reasons for that is pretty widespread, families, it's social media and so on. But actually Michael did some research on that, so perhaps he can jump in and talk a little bit about his research.
Okay,
Yeah, very brief.
Michael.
Very briefly, I guess it's a trend that we're seeing not just in Australia but around the world, that young kids, 15-year-olds, are drinking a lot less than they used to. And the evidence so far suggests that parenting is one of the key drivers, that parents are much more aware of the risks of alcohol, they're less likely to supply, they're generally more on top of where their teenagers are on a Friday night than they used to be. But also there is a sort of feeling from some of the survey data that attitudes around alcohol are just shifting, that there's a broader kind of concern about this product in the community than there was 20 years ago. And that's mostly being reflected in how young people engage with it. And it was great to see some of the kind of subcultural stuff in the TV show about how that's manifesting in these kind of straight edge communities or in other ways. It's really a fascinating topic.
Great, thanks, Michael. Look, I'll just jump straight in with a question that's come from Nick Thorne. Back to you guys, see who would like to answer. What do you the panel members think about or feel about only talking about alcohol and the bad effects of alcohol as if all alcohol consumption is alcohol abuse?
Yeah, I can have a go on that.
Yeah, sure, you can go for it.
Well, this is also very interesting. I think that in a lot of people's mind, actually, the harmful effect of alcohol starts at a certain level. When it comes to inebriation, and it's really the heavy drinking that produces the effects either in terms of alcohol dependence or in terms of drunkenness. However, in our area, we have this, what we call prevention paradox, that the most of the harm is actually produced from the large majority of people, and they just drink one glass too much that they should. And this has nothing to do with alcohol dependence or drunkenness. It's really, harm starts from the first drink. And then, as I showed in the documentary, of course, when you drink 1 or 2 glasses a day, the risk is minimum. But there's always that myth that the alcohol industry or other people like to promote, that we have a J-shaped curve, that a small quantity would protect us from risk, and that may be due for certain heart conditions. But in terms of cancer and in terms of accidents, there's clear evidence that from the first drink on, the risk is higher. And how much is higher? Well, it's just a tiny bit higher. But this kind of preventative effect of alcohol, that alcohol would be good for us, that's simply, in most cases, not true. And we're not talking, again, about alcohol dependence or abuse. It's also moderate doses of alcohol have a certain risk. And then people often say, well, but there are so many good consequences, you can socialize and so on. Well, they may be perceived like that, but you can socialize also without drinking. A couple of years ago, people said, well, cigarettes are so good for socializing. And today, well, that's less the case, right? So it's the perception of the positive consequences that we may have to rethink.
Yep, thanks. Anybody else want to have a crack at that?
I think it is really important that we point out that, 1 in 4 people don't drink alcohol. And that there are young people who are saying, as Michael and Emmanuel said, that, this isn't for me. I don't want those negative consequences. I don't want that harms. So we have to point out that there are lots of different subcultures. I actually feel really uncomfortable about the concept of relationship with alcohol, because generally relationships are good things.
Yeah.
But for lots of people, alcohol is a problem. And for lots of people, they have a story about how it's impacted on their lives. And we need to be listening, and then we need to be acknowledging that we can be doing more, because it just shouldn't be hurting as many people as it is.
And you've mentioned about how much you've been moved by that, in fact, moved to tears by people's stories.
Yeah, when we were talking before this panel, I was saying that I've been in the role as CEO at FAIR for 4.5 months, and I knew a lot of things about the job because I've worked at FAIR before in another role. But the thing that I am constantly overwhelmed by is the number of people who come to me and share their story with me on how alcohol has impacted them. And I do spend a lot of time just in tears with people when they're sharing their stories, because the impacts are quite profound, and they impact on them and their families and this generation and the next generation. And a lot of the time those sorts of things are dismissed, and it's our job to centre those voices and to make sure those stories are heard.
Thanks very much, Caterina. Now we've got a number of questions that, in fact, people sent beforehand. We're really pleased that you have done that. And here's one from Michael, from Francis Castellino, who asked, do you believe the Sydney lockdown laws curb the amount of consumption of alcohol and reduced alcohol-related crime and injuries there? Is there an argument to extend these lockdown laws to the entire country? Now, that's being locked down in a different sense from the lockdown we're currently suffering in Melbourne. Michael, to you.
Thanks, Rob. It was interesting. The one topic the show didn't spend much time on was policy, I guess, and that's an area that I work in. And it's pretty clear from numerous evaluations on the Sydney situation that those interventions in the city and King's Cross reduce violence quite remarkably at night. So between 10 and 50%, depending on the measure and the location, violence has fallen in those areas. And there's been a tiny amount of shift to it. A bit of violence has popped up in other suburbs, but nowhere near a full displacement. So there's been a lot of people, prevented from going to hospital or injured in other ways due to those policies. Whether they should be applied everywhere is and I guess the key thing to say is that probably the lockout part of the policy, where the people can't enter a venue after 1:30, is not as important as the closing hours, where venues can't serve alcohol after 3 in the morning. And really, that kind of policy seems reasonably sensible to me in most settings. I know Melbourne kind of prides itself on having a different vibe to Sydney, but there's pretty good evidence globally, really, that if you change the hours, at late night hours at which alcohol can be sold, you can reduce harm. So it's really about whether governments want to reduce those harms or not, and that's a lever they can pull that is generally pretty effective. Yeah,
well, I'm in Melbourne at the moment. There's no vibe at all.
That's right, exactly.
Another one, this time from Sarah Richfield from Hello Sunday Morning. Thanks very much, Sarah. She found it really interesting that when Shaun was chatting with the older ladies in the assisted living complex, how one of them basically expressed that she drinks beer and how when she used to drink red wine, she was not her best self. So thoughts, maybe Emmanuel, on the differences in mood or character changes that red wine may bring opposed to beer.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? The personal stories we create around different types of drinks. You could also say, well, an IPA beer makes me different than a stout or whatever. These are stories that people, perhaps experience, of course, in a certain environment. But this is, at the end, the ingredient is alcohol, and whatever you drink as an alcoholic beverages will have similar effects. There may be some interactions with sugar, but otherwise, it's more the personal rationale we create behind the story that we think, oh, that is good for this, or this is good for that. And that may have its significance when it comes to the social context. Of course, some beverages are more appropriate in certain contexts, of course. And this is something that also Megan investigates, what we said about the proportions, and the kids pick that up already. So actually, what we think is our pure experience is a lot of cultural values and that we learned a long time ago. And once we learned that, it can be years and years after that we are already influenced by these cultural settings.
Yeah. Thanks. And a question online or now from Mary Walker. Thanks, Mary. She was saying, look, I just wondered what ethical issues the panelists think are raised, if any, by the normalisation of drinking or drunkenness, and more generally, whether you think bringing ethics into the argument could play some role in addressing some of these harms or not. So ethics and booze. Who wants to have a crack at that? Okay, well, I'll dob you in. Emmanuel, you have a quick crack at it and the others can think about it.
Not sure. Well, I don't understand the question, actually.
Well, I guess it's just around, is there an ethical component to thinking about the notion of normalisation of drinking or drunkenness? So, do in your research, do you use any form of ethical dimension, ethical perspectives in terms of trying to work out policy in this area?
In my eyes, it's a very complex question, and I think therefore there was a moment of silence. Because on the one hand, you think, well, everyone is responsible for their own actions. On the other hand, of course, where is unethical behavior starting when we think in terms of harm to others, for example? Well, we do not only harm ourselves, but also others. But it's also, harming yourself if you are responsible for others, being a parent, being caring for someone. There is this gray area, right, where my own behavior hurting myself is unethical. But I think one of the questions here is also risk. It's not that each drink would immediately lead to consequences, and even drinking a lot often does not lead to immediate consequences and even to long-term consequences. I think that's the main problem, right? If we would have a better feeling of risk, then we would be more cautious with drinking, I guess. But it's like brushing your teeth. If the consequences come 20 years later, then it's really difficult, especially when you perceive personally positive effects. Why should I avoid these positive effects that I perhaps perceive for myself, and give that up for the long-term, perhaps harmful consequences that may or may not occur? But the scientific evidence is relatively clear in that respect. You put yourself at risk. That's the thing.
Thanks. I want to come back to the show again, and maybe what came out of the filming. And this is for you, Megan, really, and for the others as well. But and thanks to Heidi Grieshaber from the Australian Drug Foundation, who asked, was there anything you witnessed while filming that challenged the current evidence base on alcohol consumption in Australia? Or did the anecdotal evidence really just confirm what the quantitative data already shows?
I think in my case, this was the first time I'd actually got to sit down with a group of young children and kind of go through my research questions, my interview schedule with them. I'd done a little piloting beforehand, but really hadn't had a chance to give it its real big test. So it did confirm a lot of the kind of hypotheses I'd had based on the previous international research, but also a lot of the anecdotal evidence that I'd heard from parents talking to them about my research. It's very common for parents to say, when you say, I'm doing research on what young children know about alcohol, oh yeah, well, my daughter or my son said so-and-so the other night when I had a glass of wine. So it kind of confirmed that. But I don't think it was anything completely revolutionary or new. And I think overall the show really just did provide almost a very human element behind the kind of quantitative data that we do know about. It showed those kind of personal stories and gave that insight rather than providing a whole new set of evidence, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks. And another issue and it's really interesting point coming from Peter Sarich from the Cancer Council. And he talked about Caterina, you might want to think about this, but also for the others, the fact that the 2019 FAIR annual alcohol poll reported that just 16% of Australian adults are aware that alcohol causes breast cancer. Shaun Micallef highlighted how surprising this is to many people. How can we raise awareness about the relationship between alcohol as a carcinogen?
Yeah. I think that this was the thing that Shaun said really shocked him as well. And in lots of interviews, he says that he's really shocked to find that alcohol is a carcinogen. I want to, if it's okay, tie back to the question around ethics as well, because we're talking about, we're all being very polite and sitting back and making sure that everyone gets a chance to speak, because that's the sort of sector that we are, which is wonderful. When we talk about ethics, the thing that I think about is the responsibility of alcohol companies. So we know that 50% of the alcohol is consumed by 10% of the people. Mm-hmm. We know that for business models to be effective, then alcohol companies need to be marketing, and targeting and reaching people for whom alcohol is the biggest problem. And so when we think about ethics and when we think about the normalization of drinking to get drunk, if business models are dependent upon people drinking in that way, then what is the responsibility of these companies to be making sure that their products don't cause harms. And it comes down to alcohol being a carcinogen as well, and alcohol causing lifelong harm through fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. And what is the responsibility of these companies to be communicating these messages? Because at the moment, the only messages we get about alcohol are those from alcohol companies, and they're ones that really glorify these behaviours. And of course, awareness raising needs to play a role in that, and public education, and we need to be talking about that, and there need to be sustained and funded campaigns. But that needs to go alongside having a look at these practices by the alcohol companies themselves.
Thanks. Great comment. And look, just quickly going back to the show itself, from Anne-Marie Laslett at La Trobe, have there been reviews of the show that have been favourable or not? Do you think it's begun to initiate a broader conversation?
Oh, you go, Michael.
Well, I was going to say we're all too modest to read the reviews, I guess. I don't know if you've looked at your own reviews, guys.
I haven't looked or haven't seen anything. I mean, the main place I would see anything personally is Twitter, and been a lot. I really hope that it does contribute to a conversation more broadly. I think there's a couple of similar events like this going on that I think are a really good thing to start, but hopefully, as Kat said, I think it needs to be sustained. So we need to try and do as much as we can to keep it on the agenda, to use this momentum going forward.
Just quickly, I do think there's a kind of a shift in the conversation around alcohol. We've seen a series of books published in the past 5 or 10 years, like Elspeth Muir's, which was talked about in the show, like Jill Stark's before that talk about alcohol in this kind of popular way, you know, drawing out both the benefits and the more severe consequences, and kind of trying to initiate these conversations. And this is just another piece of that story, I think, about this conversation moving into the mainstream.
Right. Okay. Caterina, you mentioned before the notion of not drinking, because here's a question from Aaron Hart. As non-professional researchers or educators, just as society members, what are some of the practical steps we can take to help influence change, and particularly in relation to reducing the stigma of not drinking?
I think this is really important. And when we're talking about public education, I think this is absolutely key, because what happens is a lot of this keeps coming back to individual responsibility, and the focus keeps being about this person and this person's behaviour. But actually, no one wakes up one day and says, I really want an alcohol problem, so I'm going to go and get one. There are a whole range of factors in someone's life that contributes to them having an alcohol problem, and that includes systems and structures that enable this. So I think that we can all play a role as advocates. I'm going to say that, I think, because I just think advocacy is so important. And if we're not changing the systems that facilitate and enable alcohol companies to market prolifically to children and families and communities, and if we're not actually having a look at the responsibility of these companies, if we're not having a look at the regulations and how they're set up and the legislation, and if it's there to protect people, and that we have the right services so that when someone puts their hand up and says, I need help, it's there and we can help them, then we aren't doing the job of trying to prevent this harm. So the best thing that people can do is to really get across what's going on in the advocacy space and play a role in that. If you're a researcher, set up a meeting with your local MP and talk to them about your research. There are just these small things that we can do that can help to shift this conversation, and that has to happen in the systems and the structures, because otherwise a lot of these things become embedded and they become harder to undo.
Great. There's a question here from Claire Doble about how shocked she was to hear about the COVID era alcohol advertising. Are there any restrictions or guidelines on what can be said and shown in these sorts of ads? If so, what are the guidelines followed? Who enforces them? Commentary that big alcohol has so much power and influence.
This is you, Kat. This is clearly Caterina's area.
Michael, I'm sure. Okay, I'll jump in. At the moment, the alcohol industry has some guides that they've set themselves. This system has been shown to be flawed for many, many, many years. And what we've seen with COVID and alcohol is what we've seen with COVID and lots of other social issues. When there's a flawed structure there, then COVID's just really shone a light on it and it's made things much worse. So no, there is no regulation of alcohol marketing in Australia. And it's not effective and it's not preventing people from seeing these sorts of messages that are harmful. We made some complaints and others made some complaints during COVID, and some of those were upheld, but some of those, like one that was explicitly telling mums at the end of a day of homeschooling to have a drink to get through it, were not upheld. And so it shows that there's a huge problem there. The second thing I just want to say around this power of big alcohol, I think it's really important to point out that change does happen and is happening. There are people who are standing up and saying, no, this isn't okay. This isn't the community we want. You know, we want to focus on health and well-being. And so we need to stop painting them as this one homogenous body that we could never possibly get past, because that's unhelpful for us creating change. You know, we are powerful. When we come together and say, no, this isn't okay, and actually we expect more, then change can and does happen.
Lovely. Thanks. Now, I just want to come back to the issue of, Michael, you were talking about it, was the lockdown laws. There's a question from Ingrid Johnson. How can we change the culture that open late at night equals alcohol?
It's a kind of the eternal question. I mean, you look at all the reviews of liquor licensing acts over the past maybe 40 years in Australia, and one of the goals of all of them has been, how do we turn our late night culture into Paris or Milan? How do we become more, sophisticated in our approach to alcohol, especially at night? And they're hard to answer. We've tried, making the laws much more relaxed, letting different kinds of venues open later and have more venues of different types, and that's just led to more problems. There are signs, I guess, that our drinking culture can be shifted, whether intentionally or otherwise. We are seeing changes in how people drink at the moment, but it's a real challenge to figure out ways you can have venues open at 3 a.m. where anything other than kind of intoxication is the main driver, and we haven't really figured that out in this country yet.
Right, thanks. We've got a couple of questions around, and one from Roger Falcon of Flint around women and why are women so much more likely to seek help for their alcohol misuse than men?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. First of all, women are more vulnerable from a biological point of view. So the same quantity of alcohol has stronger negative effects on women. But the other thing is also that alcohol is often part and parcel perceived of, the image of masculinity, the image of man is often around drinking. There is a lot of social norms research that it's more normative for people to drink, for men to drink, especially in certain contexts. And then I think that stays in the way of admitting that alcohol is a problem. And it's not that women would be more concerned by alcohol problems, but actually men are, but they have more barriers, I guess, personal barriers, cultural barriers to actually seek help. It's like this men don't cry kind of thing, phenomenon.
Lovely. Now there's some really good, interesting commentary as well. One from Robin Room on ethics, and he's saying that a dimension that came out clearly in the show was how moralised drinking is in Australian culture. Even those reacting against someone refusing a drink are reacting in their own moralising mode to what they assume is a moral decision. Thanks, Robin. The moral dimension comes primarily from the potential effects of my drinking on others around me. This was true, of course, in the temperance era. In our own way, it still seems to be true today. So thank you, Robin, for that comment. I just some more questions. Jane Martin's asking, how do you think that we can move the community and the political policy response faster, much faster, given that the community and the culture seems to be becoming more supportive? Jump in.
I have some views on this. as I alluded to before, I think there are lots of voices of people who want change in this space, and we really need to elevate all of those voices. And that means that for some of us that work in this space, stepping back and making space for different people to share their stories and for saying the sorts of things that they want to say about alcohol. We also need to ask people. So I've been really surprised over the last few months at people coming forward and saying, what more can I do? You know, can I call my MP? Can I write an email? Can I set up a meeting? And so we need to know that there is an appetite from people to create change, and we need to be going out to them and saying, here are the different things that we can be doing. But the big one, I think, is the mind shift change. A lot has changed in the way that we view alcohol, and a lot has changed in the way that we want to see the health and well-being of our community come about over the next few years. And so we need to acknowledge that, and we need to go along with that rather than talking about the way things were or everything as a barrier. And I think that that's a really important shift, particularly for people who've been working in this space for a really long time.
Right. Thanks, Caterina. And a little bit to follow on from that discussion around, you know, we're seeing some changes go on. How do we capitalize on them? Here's a comment from Aaron Hart, and a question really is for the whole panel. Do you have any thoughts on the rise of community groups, paid programs, and non-profit sobriety groups offering community and support for people who want to actually stop drinking? Does this sort of signal the need for a wider range of recovery and drinking reduction programs led by psychologists and health professionals in Australia? Many women, for example, are turning to these online groups as the traditional models don't address the different reasons for why, for example, women drink as opposed to why men drink.
I think that's a really interesting question, and I thought it was amazing to see in the show the Sober in the Country group that had kind of sprung up in response to a lack of services that were appropriate for the people who were out there. And I think we are seeing dozens and dozens of these groups and NGOs popping up in this space, and in some ways that's great that there's a diverse range of responses to people trying to cut back on their drinking or get help with their problems with alcohol. But it does probably imply that our standard modes of treatment are kind of are pretty limited, that there are big gaps in the sector that are being filled at the moment by groups that are potentially not as, you know, regulated or qualified. So it's both a really positive thing, but raises these challenges about how do we make sure that the sector is doing the best it can to reach these people who are using other means at the moment.
Yeah. Michael, whilst we've got you, there's a question from one attendee about why is alcohol the only answer to vibrancy in nighttime economies?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's again, I don't have a good answer to this, and there are lovely examples occasionally where you have, you know, even things like White Night in Melbourne have not relied so heavily on drinking. There's been or when the art gallery has its 24-hour openings occasionally, there are examples of where you can have late night activities where alcohol is not the central focus, but it doesn't seem like we found a way to make them reliably profitable. And it's kind of the constant argument around live music is you've got to have alcohol available till 5 a.m. so gigs can proceed. But the fact that gigs rely on alcohol sales to be profitable feels like kind of a fundamental problem to me. So I think trying to find ways to make these late night events sustainable financially without the prop of alcohol sales is probably the key challenge in that space.
Yeah, great. We've got a question from a long way away from Kathy Hillman in the medical humanities lead at Exeter University in the UK. And she's sort of asking a question about FASD. The understanding relating to FASD is still pretty patchy in her view across the world. How can we ensure that all countries address this issue together?
So FASD is a lifelong disability, and FASD is caused solely by alcohol. And we've got a lot of work to do still in making sure that the condition is diagnosed and that families get the support that they need. Look, I've been reading about FASD and learning about FASD in the time that I've worked in this space over the last decade, but really in the last few months, meeting lots of mums of kids with FASD and families with FASD and people with FASD themselves, I've really begun to understand what that means. And hearing from mums like Cheryl, who has a 15-year-old son, who says, you know, having a child with FASD is like constant poolside supervision. It's this lifelong caring that needs to go on, and it impacts on the whole family. And so, yes, I think globally we need to be doing more to prevent this. I think it's really important to acknowledge that in Australia, some ministers, including Minister Micallef in Victoria, because we've got a few Victorians on the panel, supported a visible pregnancy health warning for alcohol. And that's going to be really significant in raising awareness of the fact that alcohol does cause FASD. And also that the Australian government has provided $25 million in funding for an alcohol and pregnancy campaign, which will be rolled out over the next 4 years as well. So there has absolutely been a shift, and there will continue to be a shift. You know, when I had a conversation with a politician 8 years ago, I remember sitting there with a mum of a child with FASD, and they sat across from me and said, I'm more worried about my friend being judged having a wine while they're pregnant than I am about FASD, because it's not really a thing. To conversations I've had over the last few months, which have been a lot more respectful. People acknowledge what it is, acknowledge that work needs to be done. It shows that we have made progress, but yes, there's more work to do.
So here's a question from Rob Moodie about the $25 million campaign. How can that be used, I guess, in a way, if it's done really well, to shift community attitudes on harms around drinking more generally, not just in relation to FASD?
I think this one might be for me as well, because this is the question that we've been unpacking, but 50% of pregnancies are unplanned. And so if you're targeting people when they're thinking about and planning a pregnancy, then you've really missed the boat on thinking about how we influence having pregnancies that are alcohol-free. So we really need to understand what it means to be preventing that. And it needs to be about more broadly how we look at drinking. And we also need to acknowledge that a pregnancy is not just about a woman. Usually there are two people involved, and then beyond that, especially if you're from an Italian family like mine, there might be 50 people involved in your pregnancy, and they will all visit regularly, which is wonderful. So we need to be targeting the whole community, because it does take a village to raise a child, and we need to be having a look at that holistically. Okay,
and now here's a question for you all on notice, not right now. We'll come to the last question of the day, which is, well, it's from Joanna Lee, and thank you very much for the question. What are the top 3 policy changes? It doesn't have to be policy. You can just have your top 3 changes that could be made to make the biggest difference in reducing alcohol harm in Australia. So we'll come back to all of you at the end of it. I did want to ask Megan, because you were so involved in this show, do you think that a TV show like this can help shape policy, or can it help shape research? What impact might it have had, and might it have in the future?
I think in terms of research, absolutely. There's just been such a positive response. I know Emmanuel's talked about it as well. From being in the show, it's raised a lot of awareness of the work that we do, and really gave me a great opportunity to be able to talk and publicise about our research that you don't often get through some of the more traditional ways that we go. We were able to reach a completely different audience. I don't know whether I'm necessarily the right person to speak on policy, but I think it contributes in terms of that broader conversation that we were talking about earlier, just getting it on the agenda and letting people know that it's something that we should be talking about and talking about more.
So Michael, for policy, how can this help?
I think Megan's right, to be honest, that really just shifting the kind of frame of what's considered plausible, that as this will help to shift community attitudes around alcohol in Australia, or help to reinforce the fact that those attitudes are already shifting. And that can only be helpful when we're trying to advocate with government for policy interventions to be implemented. If they, one of the reasons we've had no luck on some of the key regulatory options around alcohol has been this perception, real or otherwise, that they're very unpopular policies. And I think the more these conversations start to foreground the variety of ways that alcohol has contributed to problems in the country, the more chance there is that there'll be greater support for effective policy intervention.
Right. And Emmanuel, I want to ask you as a relative newcomer to these shores, do you think it's possible in Australia to normalise not drinking?
Well, yeah, of course. Well, there are these trends, and they're really, really good. And this is what we're working on, you know, how to make non-drinking more acceptable. But of course, that's not, you know, that does not require one action. It's a long process, and this was so good about that documentary that this is the next stepping stone. You know, it just adds to the pile of it's okay not to drink, right? It's not, and this was also the documentary make me thinking, because a lot of my research I did on drinking motives, so the motivation why people engage in drinking. And then some of the colleagues said, well, but in other populations, you should more study the reasons about not drinking. And I found that strange, you know, why would you need a reason, a motivation not to take alcohol? You know, that was, but this is, I think this is exactly what is shifting, and whether people think more about, it's not an ordinary thing. It's not the first reaction to do. And then, but I think the big challenge is, you know, all these associations that we have, and these are physiological associations, psychological association, cultural association, what is appropriate, and to look beyond that. But I think exactly this discussion here is another step towards the normalization of non-drinking.
And there's a question from Sam Wilson about that, about how can we be allies or better allies to sober friends?
Well, you know, be already allies to sober friends. You know,
yeah.
I think that's already the magic bullet. And this is also what Shaun, in a way, wanted to promote. You know, acceptance, but not only for your friends, actually, also for yourself to consider. You know, do I really need that drink now? Do I really need the second, the third, the fifth, the 10th drink at that moment, or would it be okay, you know, just to skip one?
Right. There's a question here about from Jeanette. If the ABC wanted to do a second series on alcohol, what topics should they tackle? In other words, what might have they missed out in this one?
I would have loved to see more of those uncomfortable interviews with the industry. I really found that little segment where he talked to the marketing guy from the industry quite entertaining. And I think having those, that would just make good TV, in my opinion. He's kind of talking to people, challenging them on these topics.
Like Jonathan Swan talking to Donald Trump. I know. Okay, well, look, we want to wrap up pretty soon, so I'll come back to all of you on Jonah's question. So it's, what are your top 3 policy changes, or just top 3 changes that could be made to make the biggest difference in reducing alcohol harm? So Caterina, maybe I can kick off with you.
I thought that might happen, Rob. Okay, so the first one I'm going to say is that we have to acknowledge the impacts in people's lives that contribute to risky alcohol use. So we can lend our name and our support to campaigns like Raise the Age, around raising the legal age of criminal intent, because we know lots of kids who end up in prison prisons have conditions like fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are overrepresented, and it leads to the cycle of trauma. And also things like raising the rate around income support. The second thing is that this is a rapidly changing space. So the industry, different segments of the alcohol industry are targeting people and engaging people in different ways. There are 4.5 million Australians who are members of Dan Murphy's. And so the data that Woolworths is able to collect on people and the way that they're able to target them is at a different level. And even things like online deliveries, which are quite normalised now in this new world, you know, they're not regulated in most states and territories. So we're not keeping up with that pace of change on things that are just basic community standards that we're all agreed on, like that, you know, alcohol shouldn't be sold to children and they shouldn't be sold to people who are intoxicated, for example. And then finally, I'm going to say marketing, because of that more sophisticated nature and because of the fact that we're seeing this preying on vulnerable people during this time. we really do have to fix marketing, and we have to stop that prolific marketing that's really quite harmful.
Great, thanks very much. Michael.
Firstly, I really agree with Kat's point about kind of broader social policies being important, that alcohol problems are often a symptom of bigger issues in society, and dealing with inequalities and so forth is likely to be hugely effective. But specifically around alcohol, WHO has its 3 best buys, and they seem like the most strongly evidence-based, and that's to increase price, usually via some sort of tax mechanism, to reduce availability via both times that alcohol is available and the number of places that sell it, and to manage promotion in better ways. And that just, they're all pretty straightforward, pretty well evidenced, and I think it's not a complicated issue for how we can move forward in this space.
Thanks. Megan.
Yeah, Michael's taken mine. I was going to say about the WHO's best buys as well. I think, yeah, they're really driven by a good evidence base and seeing really clear and easy things that we can do. It really is just about disrupting, as Emmanuel has said many times, the kind of normalization and the omnipresence of alcohol. Maybe thinking a little bit more about that and making it not so prevalent in all aspects of our lives. And I think the WHO best buys are a great step towards that.
Yep. I think they're clear to do. They may not be easy to do. Sort of talking about political capital. Thank you, Megan. And our last cab off the rank, Emmanuel.
Well, a lot of things were already mentioned. For me, you know, relatively clearly in one word is to decrease availability, and that's such a big challenge, because at the end of the day, you know, no one liked that. You know, the industry don't like to decrease availability because they make profits out of it. The drinker does not like to decrease availability because they would like to have it conveniently available, cheap, around the clock, and so on. And the politician at the end is dependent on the majority of drinkers. But this is about to change. You know, any measure that opens the idea of decreasing availability is a good measure.
Great.
As simple as that. But put that into practice, that's the big challenge we are facing.
Okay, well, thank you all. We might wrap up now, and I just wanted to thank Megan and Caterina, Emmanuel and Michael for allowing us into their bedroom, office, or living room, or whatever, and also to thank you all very much for being online. We're sort of delighted that you could have come on board. Thank you to Suzanne for organising today, and we're really and Sarah, we're really appreciative of that. We're delighted you could have us in your office or wherever, and we look forward to some really substantial shifts in what's going on to reduce alcohol harm in Australia. So thank you all very much indeed.
Thanks, Rob.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, everyone.